John drove slowly along the winding road that led to the cemetery, where he visited his late wife Elizabeth's grave every week. That day seemed different, however. The sun was setting over the horizon, tinting the sky with shades of orange and purple, while the shadows of night were beginning to engulf the landscape around them. The road was deserted, shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the soft rumble of his car's engine. The loneliness John felt was almost palpable. He had lived alone since Elizabeth's death. The routine of visiting her grave was his only way of staying connected to the life they had shared. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, but inside he felt fragile, adrift in a sea of painful memories. As he drove, John's thoughts were invaded by memories of Elizabeth. The sound of her laughter, the way she held his hand, and the long talks they had at dusk. All that was now lost forever, and the only thing he had left was that lonely walk to the cemetery. The road, normally so familiar, now seemed longer and emptier. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was different that day, something indefinable. He felt a heavier weight on his chest, as if the emptiness of the loss was finally crushing him. His weekly visits to Elizabeth's grave always comforted him in some way. But that day, the loneliness seemed more intense than ever. Darkness began to take hold, and the shadows of the road seemed to stretch out, swallowing everything around them. John adjusted the car's headlights, trying to dispel the discomfort that was beginning to take hold of his thoughts. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate on the road ahead, his mind kept returning to Elizabeth. The pain of the loss was immeasurable, and at that moment, he felt more alone than ever. John was still lost in his memories, his empty gaze fixed on the road ahead. Elizabeth's image still hovered in his mind. Every detail of her physiognomy remained vivid, as if he could hear her calling out to him one last time. The fond memories were beginning to obscure his perception of the world around him. His hands, once firm on the steering wheel, now trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability he insisted on hiding. The road, now completely covered by night, seemed more treacherous. At every turn, the car swayed gently, but John didn't notice. He was so immersed in the past that he didn't even realize that the once familiar road had turned into a dark and dangerous path. The car's lights tried to illuminate the asphalt, but seemed unable to penetrate the growing darkness around them. It was at that moment, between one bend and another, that distraction took its toll. An instant of reverie, and suddenly the car began to slide off the road. John's eyes widened, but it was too late. A deafening noise broke the silence as the car crashed violently into a tree on the side of the road. The impact was brutal. Inside the car, everything stopped. The world seemed to hang in the balance. John was unconscious, his body slumped against the seat. Outside, the scene was bleak. The empty road, total darkness, and the wrecked car. The only sound that could be heard was the faint wheeze of the still warm engine and the wind that blew through the trees, creating a frightening and lonely scene. The silence that followed the impact was disturbing. There was no one around to help, no one who could hear or see what had happened. John was alone, trapped in that twisted piece of metal on a deserted road, with no sign of help in sight. John was trapped inside the wreckage of the car, unconscious, while the night advanced, covering everything with a veil of deadly silence. The wind whispered between the trees, moving the leaves like silent witnesses to his accident. There were no signs of life nearby, no lights on the road, no help in sight. Only darkness surrounded him, relentless. But in the shadows, something moved. Suddenly, a small figure emerged from the darkness. A cat with dark fur and glowing eyes, almost supernatural in its presence. The animal moved with disconcerting calm, watching the wrecked car and the unconscious man trapped inside it. Its eyes shone like beacons in the night, fixed on John, as if it knew exactly what to do. With precise, graceful movements, the cat moved even closer, skirting the pieces of glass scattered on the asphalt and the fallen branches of the trees. It jumped onto the hood of the car with an almost impossible lightness, as if it were floating. The surroundings were so quiet that only the faint wheeze of the hot engine filled the space. The cat, with an almost unnerving serenity, walked around the hood and then entered through the broken window. As if it knew exactly where to go, it snuggled into John's lap. There, in that wrecked car, in the middle of nowhere, the animal seemed to be fulfilling a mysterious purpose. Silence prevailed, and time seemed to have stopped. Curiously, a warmth began to emanate from the cat. Something subtle, but comforting. Even unconscious, John seemed to relax, as if he were being protected by the creature that had inexplicably appeared at the darkest hour. And so, in the midst of the most absolute loneliness, that mysterious presence brought a sense of comfort and hope, while the night continued to swallow up the world around them. Mark was exhausted. After a long and exhausting day at work, all he wanted to do was get home, take a shower, and rest. As he took an alternative route to avoid the downtown traffic, something unusual caught his eye. A dim, almost imperceptible light shone on the side of the road, coming from the dense forest. He frowned, his instinct warning him that something was wrong. Driven by a growing unease, Mark stopped the car and took out his cell phone, activating the flashlight to light the way. The silence of the night was almost suffocating, broken only by the light wind that swayed the trees. He followed the distant sound of a muffled engine until the flashlight revealed a scene of shock. A wrecked car lay there, half hidden among the trees. He approached quickly, his heart beating fast. Looking through the broken window, he saw an elderly man, unconscious behind the wheel, his face pale and covered in cuts. But what really made him recoil in surprise was what was on the man's chest. A dark, bright-eyed cat, nestled calmly, as if protecting him. But what? Mark whispered to himself, completely stunned. The scene seemed straight out of a nightmare or some surreal movie. The man was injured, but the cat. The animal remained motionless, its eyes fixed on Mark with an unsettling serenity. Mark tried to open the car door, but it was stuck, crumpled by the impact of the crash. Panic began to seize him. He had to act fast. He picked up his cell phone with trembling hands and dialed the emergency services, explaining the situation in a voice laced with adrenaline. While he waited, Mark looked repeatedly at the cat, which seemed oblivious to the chaos around it. "What are you doing here?" he muttered, as if the animal would be able to respond. But the cat didn't move, remaining in its place, cuddled up as if fulfilling a purpose that Mark couldn't understand. The silence around them was oppressive, and every second that passed seemed like an eternity. The darkness made the wait even more agonizing. The cat, however, seemed to be the only one not to be bothered. It didn't move from its spot, as if it were watching over the man, keeping an enigmatic yet welcoming eye on his life. Mark stood next to the wrecked car, his heart racing. Every second of waiting seemed like an eternity. The darkness around him was oppressive, and the only company he had was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. He looked again at the unconscious man trapped in the car, the elderly man whose life seemed to be hanging by a thread. And of course, the cat. Always motionless, almost statuesque, still nestled on the man's chest, its eyes shining as if it knew something no one else did. Mark rubbed his hands together, trying to stay calm, but the anguish was growing. The tension in the air was unbearable. "Come on, where are you?" he whispered impatiently, his eyes fixed on the road, waiting for the paramedics to arrive. The feeling of helplessness weighed heavily on his shoulders. Time seemed to be playing tricks on him, dragging slowly, making the wait even crueler. Then, in the distance, a sound broke the silence. Sirens. The sound came closer, bringing a wave of relief, but also increasing the urgency. Mark quickly turned back to the car. "Hang in there, man, they're coming," he muttered, more to himself than to the unconscious man. The cat didn't move. The glow of sirens finally emerged, illuminating the scene. The paramedics arrived quickly, and the tension in the air intensified with the excitement of the rescue. The rescue workers began working quickly to free John from the wreckage, while Mark stood back a little, watching closely. But it was at that moment that something unusual happened. The cat, which had remained motionless until then, suddenly jumped out of John's lap. Without any hesitation, it disappeared into the darkness of the forest, as if its mission was complete. Mark blinked in disbelief. Wait, what? He ran his eyes through the darkness, trying to locate the cat, but there was no sign of it. The scene was too surreal. The animal, which seemed to be guarding the man with an almost supernatural determination, had simply disappeared. It left Mark with an unsettling feeling, a mixture of mystery and wonder. As John was carefully removed from the car and rushed to the ambulance, Mark stood still, unable to get the image of the cat out of his mind. Something about that creature didn't make sense. Something about that night had changed something inside him. But for now, the only certainty was that John had been saved. But the cat, the silent enigma, would remain etched in Mark's memory, as if it had played a crucial role that night, and now it was gone forever. John woke up slowly, as if emerging from a long, hazy dream. The dim light of the hospital invaded his eyes, and he blinked several times, trying to get used to his surroundings. His mind was confused, fragmented. He could barely remember what had happened. The last thing clear in his mind were the memories of Elizabeth, enveloping him like a suffocating fog. Now everything seemed distant, hazy. What had happened? He tried to move, but felt a sharp pain in his body, and weakness prevented him from making any greater effort. With heavy eyes, he looked around. Hospital machines monitored his vital signs, and the repetitive beeping sound was comforting somehow. He was alive. Some time later, the door to the room slowly opened and a young man walked in. John recognized him from somewhere, but the connection in his mind was vague. "Hi, I'm Mark. You probably don't remember me, but I met you on the road that night." John blinked, confused, trying to force his memory back, but it was useless. He looked at the young man, trying to understand what was going on. Mark gave a small smile, trying to lighten the mood. I need to tell you something that happened that night. It's about the accident and the cat." "What? A cat?" John frowned, feeling disbelief invade his thoughts. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a weak whisper. "What cat?" Mark sat down on the side of the bed and began to explain, detailing the scene of the accident. He described the moment he found John unconscious in the car, with the dark, mysterious cat nestled on his chest. John listened, stunned, to the young man's every word. It didn't make sense. He didn't have a cat, never had. The idea that an animal out of nowhere could have been there all along was absurd, to say the least. "I know it sounds crazy," said Mark, seeming to anticipate John's reaction. "I almost didn't believe it myself, but that cat was there, like it was protecting you." He paused, watching the old man's reaction. John blinked, still perplexed. The memories of the crash and the rescue were vague, but he remembered a sensation, something warm, comforting. Slowly, images of a cat forming in his mind began to emerge, like fragments of a dream. I don't know what to say," muttered John, still processing the story. The mystery surrounding the cat seemed deep, rooted in something he couldn't fully understand, but which somehow comforted him. A part of him wanted to dismiss it as madness, but another felt that there was more there, something inexplicable. A few days later, Mark returned to the hospital, and this time he wasn't alone. The cat, the same one that had been with John that night, was in his arms. As soon as the animal was placed on the bed, it immediately snuggled into John's lap, as if it knew it belonged there. John, incredulous, ran a trembling hand through the cat's fur, feeling an unexpected connection, almost as if the animal knew something he didn't. The mystery continued. But at that moment, the cat was still in John's arms. The mystery continued, but at that moment, John didn't care about answers. The comfort that cat brought him was real, deep, and that was enough. The days following the accident marked a profound change in John's life. The hospital had become a place of reflection. Every beat of his heart seemed more valuable now. By his bedside, Lucky, the enigmatic cat, remained faithfully. He had named him Lucky because somehow he felt that this animal had brought him not only protection, but a new chance at life. John looked at the cat, which was purring quietly in his lap. No matter how hard he tried to understand, the feeling that Lucky was not just an ordinary cat kept coming back to him. There was something bigger at play, a purpose that went beyond any logical explanation. "You saved me, didn't you?" murmured John as he stroked the soft fur. Lucky looked at him with his eyes sparkling, as if he knew exactly what John was talking about. On leaving the hospital, John found an unexpected companion in Mark. The young man who had rescued him that night, against all the odds, became a constant figure in his life. Mark visited John often, and the two developed a genuine friendship. It was as if that accident, tragic as it may have seemed, had crossed their paths for a greater reason.